I've waited until the sky is completely dry. Now I start to wet the lower part of the sheet. Again, I pay attention to the corners because they dry faster. We need to work extensively on the water and we need some time allowance. So don't be shy and wet it well. Of course, there shouldn't be puddles, otherwise the paper will warp. And the pigment will get in between the wrinkles, creating ugly lines. I mix the color for the background. I take cerulean. You can add cool gray in it if you don't have cerulean containing white pigment. I add some cobalt green by Mijello. It also contains white. I especially emphasize that these pigments for the background should contain white pigment. They'll become more opaque. They should be light because they are in the distance, but at the same time I'll paint waves over them. And if the paper is too wet, then our waves will blur more than I'd like them to. While white pigment in this mix will keep our waves from blurring in the background. It makes our mix dense. I've added more blue pigment because we can see blue lines on water in the reference. We can take cobalt here, or even Prussian blue. We can add a little Payne's Grey for density. The one by Mijello has blue tone and fits well in such mix. Or indigo, it also has a blue tone. I take a smaller brush and using the same color that I used for the blue line, but more densely, I start to paint the waves in the background. Notice that the brush shouldn't contain much water now. That's why I squeezed it beforehand. The waves in the background should be as horizontal as possible. In its linear perspective, everything becomes smaller and smoother in the distance. While the waves in the foreground can be of different shapes, in the distance they become more horizontal. Remember about the brush movement, like we did it in the first lesson. The strokes should start with a fine line, then there is more pressure on the brush and the stroke becomes wider, and then it finishes with a fine line again. We can compare it to an elongated grass blade or a leaf. They shouldn't be like bricks. The waves have a fine starting part. That's why it's important to practice brush pressure, because it all is achieved with a fine brush tip and increasing pressure. It's the highest in the center of the wave, while I start to paint it very lightly, barely touching the paper. If you don't succeed in doing it, you can practice on a separate piece of paper. I see green tones appearing, so I add phthalo green to the mix, or it can be cobalt green. The paper starts to dry, but I intensify the color of the wave peaks, make it darker. Don't be afraid to take a dark color, because after drying it will become a few tones lighter. I continue to take phthalo green, I'm painting the waves. I don't copy off the reference, I just try to paint the waves evenly so there are no gaps, like I told you in the first lesson. And I also avoid dense accumulation of waves. My palette has filled with turquoise tones. It's hard to tell which color I'm using. It's a mix. You'll have your own mix. Make sure you stick to the tone that we discussed in the first lesson. The waves should look darker against the main light background of water. I wash my brush again. I wipe it with a cloth and make lighter the top parts of the wave peaks. They'll be lit. We can wipe them. I try to wash and wipe the brush after each movement on paper, so that I don't smudge the pigment, but remove it from paper. A dry brush is like a sponge. It absorbs extra water together with pigment. That's why such wiping is possible. If you wipe with a wet brush, then extra water will end up on paper, and it will start to push the pigments, creating ugly blooms. I add some lemon color. I see warm tones in the foreground, while in the distance everything is colder. It's aerial perspective. In the foreground, the colors take their local tone, which is the object's proper color, while it's hard to determine water's proper color as there is much influence coming from its environment. For example, water reflects both the sky and the bottom, so I add more lemon in the foreground. We can add cobalt green, horizon blue with yellow also gives an interesting tone. Each of you will have a different set of colors. I'm not saying you must buy the pigments I've mentioned. Of course, let's be realistic and analyze and decide which tones you'll need, and which tones you already have and can use. I've covered the foreground with a dense pigment, and now I start to define the wave shape. I do this with a white flat brush. I also need opacity here, so don't forget to use pigments containing white for the foreground. Horizon blue, cerulean that contains white. If you don't have such ready paints, you can buy blue-gray by Mugello, for example, and add this pigment to your mixes. While the waves in the distance were mainly horizontal, here we can see what the direction of the wave is like. We don't solely see the shape of the wave, but also what's on the bottom. The bottom is visible in the shadows of water. Here we showed the shadows, and now I'll intensify more. I add Payne's Grey to the mix, or you can add indigo. And immediately below the light part there will be shadow. We need to show it. It's border contrast. Here I consider the reference more. While the idea of the waves in the distance is understandable, in the foreground, we need to follow the reference for a more realistic image, because every time this spot distribution is unusual and interesting to look at, because the image of water changes every second. I add green midtones. Note that it's not grass green. There are greens that contain a lot of green and blue pigment, but absolutely don't have orange or red additions. Otherwise, your water will look like river or swamp rather than seawater. That's why we mix color for such water using only blues and yellows, adding a little white for opacity. However, I don't add white in the shadows. It's only used in the base first layer. While the paper is wet, I continue to intensify some spots in the shadow. I add horizon blue. It's quite dense. Now I define the shape. The paper is drying and the pigment doesn't blur so much, so we can add more precise things in our work. I squeeze the brush and wipe the top parts of the waves using a clean dry brush to make some areas lighter that are located in the light. The pigment goes back in those areas, but I continue to wipe the light spots patiently. In the places where the paper is more dry, the lines are sharper. And where it's more moist, the pigment goes back and we have to continue wiping. I'm painting on Bauholm paper, and one of its characteristics, bad ones in my opinion, is that when you wipe it, for example, we see it on the right, these spots look blurred and spotty. Can you see the wave on the right? If you worked on Saunders Waterford, they would look even. I mix some light grey and lemon. You can also take Naples yellow and add some horizon blue or phthalo green. I want to show yellow rays, glints on water. Well, more precisely, they are underwater, it's just that we see them. After I've painted the main areas, I want to blur them a little with a fan brush. My brush is number 2 by Pinex High Tech Series. You can see its size approximately. I wipe again the areas where the pigment returned using a clean brush. Here the edges aren't very even. It's Bauholm paper feature. This doesn't usually happen on Saunders Waterford. I continue to refer to the photo, looking for some interesting movements on the water. I wipe them with a clean brush. Watch the wetness level of your paper. If it's quite dry and you can't wipe, then it's time to stop. My paper is suitable wetness now, so the lines I'm wiping are quite clear but smooth.